So in this lesson, we'll be looking at measuring in fractions, and many of you have probably used a tape measure or a ruler at some point, and you've come across fractions in that sense. So in imperial measure, length can be measured in inches, feet, yards, and miles. And typically where you see fractions are for inches. Okay, so we have quarter inches and half inches, an eighth of an inch, and 16ths of an inch. And this is where equivalent fractions come in, because you can see that 4/16, if we were to reduce that either using greatest common factor or 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, that's 4/16 is equivalent to a quarter inch. Okay, so 6/8, if we reduce that to simplest form, would be 3/4 inches. 8/16 would be a half inch, and 10/16 we'd reduce that to 5/8. So in the diagrams below, they show how an imperial ruler or tape is divided. So first we have the inches, right? And then we have the rulers divided into half inches. So the half inches are all marked there. So that's a half inch. This is 1.5, so that's 1.5 inch. 2.5, 2.5 inches. Then they keep dividing. So now they're dividing the halves in half, which gives, like, if you divide a half in half, you should have a line right there. And these are quarters because there's 4 of them. If you think 4 quarters in a dollar, so there's 1 quarter, 2 quarter, 3 quarters, 4 quarters makes a full dollar. Okay, so this would be 1 1/4, 1 2/4, 1 3/4. Then they divide the quarters again in half, so halfway in between each mark for the quarters, they add another one, and these are called eighths. And you'll notice that halves, the line for halves are longer, and then for quarters, and then for eighths. Okay, so this would be 1/8, 2/8, 3/8, 4/8, 5/8, 6/8, 7/8. This would be, for example, 2 1/8, 2 2/8, 2 3/8. So you could have, for example, you could have 2 2/8, which would be the same as 2 1/4. Okay. And then they finally divide into 16ths. So they take halfway between here, the eighth mark, and put another line. And 8 times 2 is 16, so that's where they get the 16th. So that's 1/16, 2/16, 3/16, 4/16. So if you look here, 4/16 is the same as 2/8, which is the same as 1/4. Okay, so this is where equivalent fractions come in when you're measuring. So we could look over here and say, okay, this, if something were up to this line, it would be 1 3/16. Or if it were up to here, you could say it's 2 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8/16, or 2 4/8, or 2 2/4, 1, 2, or 2 1/2. So there's different ways of saying it, but these are all equivalent measures. So if we had this one saying 2 8/16, because there's 8 notches here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then we have 2 1, 2, 3, 4/8. And then we have 2 1 2/4. And then we have 2 1/2. And if you look, that's all the same measurement, right? So these are just equivalent fractions, different ways of showing what measurements are. Obviously, if something were to go to 9, 10, 11/16, you would want to measure in 11/16 because there's no equivalent on these other rulers. Okay, so 16ths is the most accurate, but if it is equivalent, then you can express it in a different way. So here we have example 1. What is the length of a line segment? So we can zoom in. There we go. And we can look here and say, okay, so we know it's at least 2 inches because it goes past the 2, but it doesn't go quite to the third. So we know it's going to be 2 and something. Okay, And then we look and we say, okay, it lines up with a 16th, so it's going to be 2 and something 16ths. Then all we have to do is count how many ticks. So it's 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 16ths, okay? So 13 16ths, because it goes right to that line. And that is in simplest form. We can't reduce that number because 13 is a prime number. The only numbers that multiply into 1 and 13, or into 13 are 1 and 13, and only 1 goes into 16. So now looking at this one at the bottom, so we know it goes past 1, so it's going to be 1 and something, and then it goes up to this one, okay? So we know, if we look at the lines, we know the tallest one is a 1/2 inch, we know the next one is a 1/4 inch, and we know the next smallest one is 1/8 of an inch. So it's going to be out of 8. And what we have to do is, okay, so for 8ths, we wouldn't count the 16ths. We would count anything that is as tall as the 8th mark or higher. So there's 1, 2, 3 8ths there. So we would say 3. The other way to do it would be, you could go, okay, it's 1 and always put it over 16, and then just count every single tick that's there. So 1 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and put that on top of 16. And then you can reduce that if you divide each of those by 2. Well, 16 divided by 2 is 3, and 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 16 divided by 2 is 8. So again, because there's equivalent fractions, so if you're going to use it using the 8ths, what you do is you line up and you line it up to the biggest tick, but you only count the ticks that are that tall or taller. So 1, 2, 3, and that tells you the 8ths. And then if that's too complicated or confusing, you just always put it over 16 and count every single tick until you get to where the line is measured. So in the metric system, length is most often measured in millimeters, centimeters, and meters. And what you would typically see on a ruler would be centimeters and millimeters. And there are 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter. So this is 1 centimeter. The centimeters are the largest ticks, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 millimeters in 1. So if we're looking at example 3, what is the length of the line segment? So if we look over here, it clearly goes past 5, so it's going to be 5. And because there are 10 millimeters there are 10 pieces, if you will, in any centimeter. So you divide it into 10 pieces, so your denominator will be 10. And then you just count how many ticks over it is. And this one seems to go right up to there. So that would be 1, 2, 3. So you would put 5 and 3/10. Okay? When you get into decimals, would know that it's 5.3. The way you could do that is by saying 5 centimeters and then put a decimal, and then however many ticks there are, you put that number. So there was 1, 2, 3 ticks, so it's 5.3. Looking at this one, what is the length of the line segment? So again, we know it goes past 3, so it's going to be 3 and something over 10, or 3 point something, and then we measure it down there, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so that's either going to be 3 8/10 or 3.8. Okay, if you have any questions with this, see your instructor. Oh, sorry, and these are in centimeters. Keep in mind, those are different from inches. All right, again, if you have questions, see your instructor.